everyone. Welcome back to another episode of What's Going On with Your Comms. My name is Morgan Tolliver, and I am the digital content lead at Shannon Strategies. And today I am joined by our director, Sheri Shannon. Say hello.
Hey y'all, hey.
So Sheri is not only our director, she is also our expert in all things earned media, all things press coverage. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about press releases, some tips, some tricks, some basics. And Sheri is going to be, our expert in all things press. So Sheri, can you just start us off? Tell us a little bit about the difference between press releases, press statements, media advisories. There's so many terms out there.
That is a really good question. I think quite often folks are like, oh, we should send a press release. And I'm like, do you actually know what a press release is? So essentially, a press release acts as a press announcement. It often can act in lieu of a press conference. And so you will see press releases written in the past tense, especially when there is a quote that is given, because you are essentially encapsulating a summary of an event that took place. And press releases can be used to announce an advocacy or legislative initiative. You may have a new book that has come out or a data product that you are releasing. Press releases also can act as just a way to let people know about events. So essentially, you generally will use a press release to send to some type of media outlet, whether it's local media, to help spread the word about an event you're hosting or a special campaign announcement. So a lot of people confuse a press release with a press statement. They are formatted very similarly and they can act in a certain way. But a press statement is essentially you just announcing your position on something. So we often see a press statement from a governor or a president, an elected official. Even a nonprofit organization may issue a statement on a Heritage Month. It might be in response to some legislative initiative that has been announced. So if President Biden says like, hey, we are canceling all student loan debt, which hopefully that would happen, you might be an organization to issue a press statement to be like, we applaud the president on announcing that he is canceling student loan debt. So we see that quite often. A lot of people may not be paying attention to those things, but elected officials and nonprofit organizations issue press statements often. And then lastly, we have a media advisory. So a media advisory is just your way of letting the press know that an event is taking place and they are invited to come cover that event. Similarly to a press release and a press statement, it's going to be formatted kind of the same way, but it doesn't have to emphasize a narrative. You really are just getting out the who, what, when, where, why to the press so they know what the event is about, who is going to be there, what time it starts, where it's located, and then just some general background as to what to expect or why this event is even taking place. So I will send a media advisory out to let press know that there's a press conference taking place. If there is maybe canvassing that's happening in a certain neighborhood with an elected official, you also can just do a media advisory for any type of event where you want to get general media coverage. So those are the three differences between a release, a statement, and a media advisory.
So we get a lot of clients who, ask us, should I send a press release? When should I send a press release? Like, what's the timeline for a press release? Typically, what do you recommend around timeline or when to send out a press release for, whatever type of coverage you're trying to get?
So we over here at Shannon Strategies primarily work in the policy advocacy and progressive political space. So I'm going to stick to kind of those timelines for us. So for a press release, we generally have a lot of buildup. You're doing a lot of planning around that timeline. So for example, we recently released a data product for a client. You have 1 or 2 weeks to think about that. There might be a fundraising event where you're like, okay, we are now in this month. The event might be 1 or 2 months from now. you'll want to send out that press release at least a month before the event takes place, because your goal is to let people know about the event and how they can register. For a press statement or media advisory, this is when things, especially within our world, gets a little spicy. So it is not uncommon, especially during the General Assembly session, for you to have to whip up something at the last minute. So that press statement might be in response to an announcement or an event that took place in the morning. And you're like, hey, we have to respond right now. One of the things that we like to do for a press statement is, even on election night, for many of our clients, whether they are political candidates or the political organizations, we have a statement ready to go, because we know, hey, these results are going to be coming out, and we are going to put out maybe a release or maybe just a simple statement on our reaction to those election results. For a media advisory, something that people must remember is the farther away you send out the advisory, those reporters may forget about your event. So if it is a Monday right now and you have an event on a Saturday, you can send out that media advisory, especially to like TV newsrooms on that Monday. They might forget because they are very day by day. So I always like to tell people, consider the timeliness of your event, what is happening in that moment. And then also knowing that you may really just be working within like a 24, 48-hour timeline for things. So for a media advisory, if today is a Monday and I have an event on a Saturday, I'm probably not going to send out that advisory until Thursday. I will make a phone call on a Friday to let folks, like, to go around the room to make sure that they got it. And then I'm also going to just call, especially some of those newsrooms, those TV newsrooms, on that Saturday morning, just to see what their coverage might be like for the day.
So I wanted to revisit what you said about press statements and press releases, especially around statements and sharing reactions to a certain topic. Another strategy that we often talk about with clients are op-eds and letters to the editor. What's the difference between, say, sending a release or putting out a statement and doing something like an op-ed?
Another really good question. And I feel like a lot of folks sleep on letters to the editor or op-eds, because they are an effective way of voicing your concerns and letting people know where you stand on a position. It also could just be an effective way in general and letting people know what is even happening. So for one of our clients, when around the childcare crisis, we were advocating for family childcare. And so I think in that conversation, a lot of folks really center on childcare looking a certain way, but they may have neglected the home-based providers who also do this line of work. An op-ed gives you an opportunity to use that column space to advocate, enlighten, and really educate people on a specific issue area. And it's really good if you might have a controversial take on something. So most newspapers will have a columnist or an op-ed section, and you might read that coverage and be like, I do not agree with what that person had to say. Boom, you can write an opinion piece on what you think that position should be, or given your thoughts on whatever that issue area is. The difference really here is kind of word count. Letter to the editor, you're looking at maybe anywhere between 200 to 300 words. An op-ed, you're looking at anywhere between 650 to 800 words. And every newsroom has different standards. So it's important, before you sit at your computer or you bust out that pen and paper, to check the guidelines to see what the word count parameters are. More often than not, if you live in a specific area, let's say if you're a county or city resident, that newspaper will run your letter to the editor because they want to hear from the folks who live within those communities. So you really have a higher chance of getting a letter to the editor printed, more so than an op-ed, because it can get a little competitive, for that column space. So always just be mindful, again, one, what the guidelines are. Two, making sure that you have something that's a little spicy or newsworthy, something that's not being talked about at that moment. And then lastly, be cognizant of other current events that are taking place. So if suddenly a dozen wildfires appear, now they don't disappear, but if there's some type of disaster event in your area, coverage is going to go toward that disaster. So you always want to just be thinking about what is relevant, what might be a little bit evergreen, and what's going to be important to those readers in your community.
I think that that brings up my next question really nicely. For clients that we work with, but also for anyone watching this video who just doesn't have experience working with journalists or writers, and doesn't have experience in that earned media world, what are some expectations that they can have around a press release and pitching, or an op-ed and pitching? Like, what does that look like?
Man, I think folks always want to shoot for the New York Times, and I have to be like, but let's humble ourselves a little bit here. What when it comes to expectations, especially if you are new to trying to get earned media, one, I do want to start on a positive note and say that local journalism is great and we must support our local journalists, but also realize that many of our newsrooms are shrinking, unfortunately, due to these awful corporate overlords. And so there are reporters in your community who are your neighbors and they live by you. They shop at the same grocery stores. They also care about the same things, but they may be a little overworked. That does not mean they don't care about your story, but I just want to keep some things into perspective on what coverage looks like these days. Some news outlets are able to do a better job of getting that press release into rotation or covering your story compared to others, just based on simple resources and who they have within that newsroom. So that's something that we generally like to make clients aware of. The other thing is, where does your news story kind of fit into the spectrum of coverage? Is this a feel good piece? Is this something that involves a lot of community members? Is it an in person event? Compared to something that might be a little bit more complex and nuanced, if you're focusing on like Medicaid or health insurance, that's going to take a little bit more time and a little bit more skill for that type of story to come together. So I think when you're issuing a press release, know that you don't just send it into the atmosphere and you really kind of just hope for the best. You want to follow up with that with newsrooms and those reporters. You also want to ask those newsrooms, especially if you're going to start doing earned media a little bit more consistently, what are they looking for? What type of stories do they want to cover? What type of data do they need? Who do they not have connections to? Who do they want to be connected with within your community? All of those things. So not only do you want them to cover your story, but make sure that you can be a resource for them as well. So it's not uncommon for us here at Shannon Strategies for reporters to reach out to me and be like, hey, I'm doing a story on such and such. Do you know somebody? And chances are I do. And if I don't know somebody, I know somebody who's going to know somebody. So that's how you build a lot of those relationships and also start to understand what newsrooms are doing, what they want to cover, how they want to cover stories in the long term.
And of course, if you need any help with your earned media strategy or press coverage, we here at Shannon Strategies are here to help. You can, of course, learn more at our website, shannonstrategies.com. Any final tips, tricks, comments, Sheri?
You know, something funny that happened to me recently, because you know how when we have to send out mass emails, it's a stressful event, right?
Yes.
And you're like, oh my gosh, are all the I's dotted and T's crossed? Are there not any typos? I will say, when sending out press releases, and I know it can be a very daunting task, try to minimize errors as much as possible, so folks understand and take your issues very seriously. But at the same time, don't stress about it. do not stress, because once you have those relationships in place and you're able to maybe pick up the phone and call somebody or text a reporter, it takes the load off just quite a bit. And I have some examples, lots of examples of emails that I have seen from elected officials that have not been the best release, but they still are able to get their story out there. So that is kind of like my final advice to everyone. It can seem daunting, but it's okay at the end of the day.
Yes, as we always say, give yourself some grace. It will all work out. And we do have a blog post with some of those examples available if you'd like to check that out on our website. But that is it for today's episode of What's Going On with Your Comms, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Bye.